Bad news for some stocks today in the United States, especially the likes of like Nvidia, which was counting on selling its chips to these AI companies for years and years at a much higher price. Doug Flynn joins us ahead of the closing bell, Flynn Zito Capital Management. So this has been kind of, well, I think it's been really, really interesting to watch. We already had a few guests on talking about it. As I right at the top of the show, I said it could be a huge story, or it could be kind of one of these days we're seeing a huge overreaction because no one really knows what we're dealing with in the story.
Right.
But what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's the initial reaction to whether or not these companies do need to spend the tens of billions of dollars that they plan to spend on AI if they can do it much cheaper and easier with alternative software. Now, what I tend to think is that you're right; it's somewhat of an overreaction. I mean, Nvidia lost about $500 billion in market cap today, which means, I mean, there's only 16 companies in the world that are worth $500 billion, and they lost that today.
In one day, right? In one day.
In one day.
Right.
And it's because, you know, do all these companies need to buy all the chips that are so expensive from them, and maybe they don't, or maybe that they can use those chips to enhance what is already happening, and we're seeing a speeding up of this technology that is also going to pick right back up on our side. So
right.
It's the initial reaction to the negative, just in case it isn't going to all make its way to U.S. companies and Nvidia in particular. But the whole tech area kind of got blasted.
Well,
today.
it depends kind of how you see the bigger picture in all of this. This is true for any kind of in the history of kind of technology being developed. We've seen things like this before, especially when China's involved. And at one point, I guess it was Japan years ago. But especially since China became such a huge player, right? The United States has been a place for innovation. We have the greatest minds in terms of being creative and innovative. We have universities like Stanford and MIT and others that are doing the biggest and best and most cutting edge research. So we come up with the ideas. Now. The next step, there's a guy named Kai-Fu Lee who's written a lot about AI from China who has said this himself. And his point was always like, yeah, that's always going to happen. But then what's going to happen is China, because they have so many people and such hardworking engineers, they're going to be the ones to take it to scale and do it much cheaper. So we've seen that over and over again. So that's kind of the, I guess, worry is maybe that's happening again,
it is.
Right?
It could happen, and I think that's part of the risk in these early technologies and seeing how it's all going to be incorporated. And all these companies that are willing to spend tens of billions of dollars, maybe it just gets redirected to some degree, which is kind of why everything's adjusting. But the issue with the chat alternative to ChatGPT, their chat here with DeepSeek is it's still, because it's Chinese based. Go ahead and ask it a political question and see what comes out of it.
Right.
Because it's still subject to all those Chinese rules. And
is it on the chat? We can't use it. Not that I don't know if I would do it anyway. That's an interesting point you bring up, but it was out for Americans today. Either it's overwhelmed, maybe they should have used better chips. Either it's overwhelmed, or it's, as it says, some sort of an attack on the company that so that you don't know who to believe. But your point is, when it was working and you're American, you ask it about Tiananmen Square, and it's suddenly lost its memory.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is part of it too, is like you can't always believe everything that comes out of China. That's always been the case, and that's not going to change. And so they said they developed this with about $6 million in about 2 months. And very few people believe that. So, I mean, but how do you know? You don't know. But then that just means that, hey, if this is the new arms race and it's going to be over AI, which is fine, then, hey, they did their part. Now let's see what we can do. Can we overcome that and take all that they're doing and even take it to the next step and go further? Because, I mean, the companies are willing to contribute this kind of money to this technology to have the edge be here in the U.S. They've even limited some of these chips going to China, and they were still able to do this on somewhat older chips. But I mean, it just ups the game, and we'll see what we're made of. And those kind of competition things, I think, are a healthy thing. But of course, we want to win, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, so one stock market question right before the close. We have less than a minute left, and then we're going to broaden this discussion because there's a lot to get into with Trump and Xi Jinping and everything else. So Nvidia or Broadcom or any of these Palantir, these other stocks that were down a lot today, is this buying opportunity? You think there's more selling to come? Hard to predict. What would you say?
Yeah, initially in a drop like this, I will say that here in our office, about 2-to-1 people want to add to their tech positions, looking at this as an opportunity to get things that kind of got away from them. So look, you kind of have to go in about half of the way that you think you're going to go, because if there is another leg down, you want to be able to go the rest of the way.
Right.
But it's certainly a buying opportunity if you believe in it, and that these firms can pivot. I mean, were they just one-trick ponies, or can they do other things? And if so, these are the kinds of opportunities you're looking for. Conversely, though, interestingly, Apple up 3%.
Right.
And so its hindrance of being behind the ball on AI and not spending a lot now suddenly is a positive, because they didn't spend a lot of money on AI. And so now it's just interesting to see how it all plays out. But
that
I
is
think
really
it could be a little
interesting.
bit of a buying opportunity.
All right, like I said, there's a lot to talk about, which we're going to do here, especially the politics of it all. Maybe if Trump gets involved or says anything about this. Closing bell time, though. Let's look at these numbers. And again, to Doug's point, it's not everywhere. Not only Apple is up, but if you look at the left side of the screen, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is higher today by almost 300 points. So there's no effect there. The broader market, right side of the screen, is the S&P 500. It's down, okay, by 1.5%, but the real damage is in tech land. NASDAQ Composite down by 3%. Stocks like Nvidia down by far more than that. So, all right, let's stay on this. As we say, Doug is already here, and we want to expand our panel here and bring in Brandon Daniels, as this is Deep Seek. What we're talking about, this is grabbing a lot of people's attention. Now, Brandon's the CEO of a company named Exeger. He's on the show a lot. And one of the reasons we want to talk to him about this today is because his firm uses AI, right, to help companies kind of navigate supply chain risk and that kind of thing. But he knows a lot about it, big picture, and is involved with a lot of different companies. And Colby Hall, with his perspective, NewsNation contributor, founding editor at Media. In fact, Colby, let me go to you first, because the big picture on this is, as I said at the top of the very show, is either this is some huge story developing here, race between China and the United States, or, as Doug and I were talking about, some sort of a huge overreaction. And it'll be interesting to see if this company gets its act together. It doesn't appear to have it this afternoon, whether American consumers play a role in that and are willing to use it, or are they scared off by everything that's been going on with TikTok? How do you see all this?
I think it's a big disrupting moment, right? I can't predict the future, and I don't know how big that moment is. There's a few variables that I think sort of stand out. They were able to solve this problem and compete directly with these established sort of AI bots like Gemini and OpenAI incredibly well, sort of, overnight, relatively speaking. They also released this open source, right? So it really sort of undermines and sort of cuts into the revenue model that is sort of why we see Nvidia and so many in the tech sort of market, the stock prices sort of collapse. I suspect the market will sort of correct, as it always does. I think politically this is an interesting story, because the timing of the big sort of AI infrastructure announcement for Texas, $500 billion announcement last week in the White House with Trump, that timing is a little bit off, right? Like, it doesn't look like that really is as relevant. Of course, all that money goes to infrastructure. Maybe it can be more useful, with a more efficient model that is now open source from DeepSeek. But I do think this is a big deal. How big it is, only time will tell.
All right. So, Brandon, like I said, you're involved in a lot of different industries through your own company. Talk to a lot of different people around the world. I know you were over there with the global elite, such as it is at Davos last week, for example, all that kind of thing. So when you hear someone like Mark Andreessen, who's a big player in Silicon Valley for years and years, co-founder of Netscape, and is one of the big venture capitalists now, say that this is a Sputnik moment for artificial intelligence, kind of a wake-up call for everybody, race between China and the United States. What do you say? How do you see all this?
Look, I think Mark Andreessen is a smart guy, and so I'm not going to refute that this is a moment in time that corrects or puts in check our, sort of sole AI aspirations. But at the same time, we have very little visibility to the underlying development that went into this technology. That's the first point that we have to say factually.
So in other words, when they say they're spending like $5 or $6 million for something that a U.S. company might spend hundreds of millions of dollars, we don't know if that's true, right?
We don't know if that's true.
It may not be true.
100% right. The second thing is we build artificial intelligence, and one of the things that we do before we start putting our data through generative AI systems is we take it through these huge text filters, these huge text analytics filters, to find the data that needs to be available to the AI at that moment, and it reduces our cost of AI 100 to 1. So the fact that they've built a pipeline that allows you to get information into the chatbot more effectively and more efficiently and run it on old chips, like I run a lot of those large scale processes in the cloud. It costs me next to nothing, and then it goes into a chatbot and comes out the other side. And then the other thing that was said just a second ago, and you mentioned the Tiananmen Square lookup. Look, the regulation of data in China makes it so that this system is almost hopeless to eventually achieve the scale and nuance and sophistication of some of the things that we're seeing Anthropic or OpenAI develop. It's just not at that level, and I think that there's a lot left to be seen. So
calm down, everybody. It's interesting, Colby. Two people, to your point earlier, that have not spoken about this today, and maybe there's a reason for it because Andreessen, all these people have spoken. No, I don't think Elon Musk has said much. Maybe a little bit, but and President Trump. What do you make of that, Colby, if anything?
Well, I think that it seems that a lot of people, not just politically, but in the tech sector, were caught surprised. Like they weren't really, ready for this. And so I suspect they're getting their ducks in a row and trying to figure out, what's the best model. Trump doesn't want to sort of admit that the U.S. is getting beat by China. And it's too early to say that. And it's sort of beyond my expertise from a coding perspective. But yeah, no, this is not a good thing. I mean, I saw a joke on Twitter that David Sachs took 1 week as the sort of AI czar, and it didn't take long for China to beat him. That's
might be, yeah, right.
Yeah, if there is a space race, this is the Sputnik metaphor that Andreessen came up with, and I think it's legit.
What about you, Doug, on all of that? Is there? I mean, maybe there is nothing Trump can say, but it usually doesn't stop him. So he's kind of interesting.
No, it doesn't stop him. But I think, if you're trying to do, hey, what's in my fridge and what can I make from what's in my fridge, that probably will work. When we get to these, much more extreme and other layers with the limitations of China, I think that's going to be an issue. But I mean, it does raise the bar on what we're going to need to do here in the U.S. And I think that's why the market's reacting a little bit to say, hey, let's take a step back and figure out what are we going to do. If this basic stuff is going to be covered, we have to be even more creative and do more with it. And I think we can rise to that challenge. And so, challenge accepted. Let's see what happens.
Well, we did pretty well with the other one. We got to the moon and the whole thing. So, they right. Maybe that. So maybe even if you don't think, I'll leave this be the last word to you, Brandon. That Andreessen is 100% right about that. What if we assumed he was and got and used it as a moment like that? That's not a bad thing either. If we want to be more competitive, be more efficient, because we do have to compete with China, right?
Absolutely. So the Sputnik moment led to the Apollo 11 moment, right? And these are moments where we get to go back to the drawing board. Look, I don't think that AI infrastructure that Trump is promoting is like, Spain planting trees for the Spanish Armada, not knowing that steel would come. The fact is that these data centers are going to be useful, and they're going to be used for everything from robotics to changing our supply chains to automating our manufacturing to making it so that we can make things here in the States again. There is a huge investment into both satellite communications like in Starlink and internet, and there's a huge investment in on-the-ground infrastructure, and both of those things will be valuable for our future.
All right, good perspective. Thank you, Brandon. Always good to have you on. Doug as well, and Colby, great to see you. We should